Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. I hope you had a great start into 2022. Over the course of the last 2 years, a lot has happened. Not only all the stuff that's going on in the world, but also when it comes to camera equipment. Personally, I started the year 2020 with 3 DSLR cameras and 7 EF lenses. And now I'm heading into 2022 with just 2 EF lenses and 0 DSLR cameras. So a lot has happened. In those 2 years, I had the chance to use and test a large range of different camera bodies and lenses, and ultimately also ended up buying a whole bunch of them. So today I want to share with you what I liked about the gear and what I didn't like about the gear. So hopefully it will help you to make the right gear decisions going forward. You may have guessed already that by going from 3 to 0 DSLR cameras, the end of the road for the DSLR camera has arrived, at least for me personally. When I say that, I don't mean that DSLR cameras are not good anymore, you can't take great images with them. That's not the case at all. They're just as good as they've always been, but there's just some new technology around now that makes it a lot easier to capture certain scenes and certain images, so I'm drawn to that. But generally speaking, I would typically recommend people that are looking to buy a new camera to look at mirrorless cameras. If I was looking to buy a DSLR camera, I would try to find a used one or heavily discounted DSLR camera. I would really stay away from buying a brand new DSLR camera because I think ultimately over the course of the next few years you will likely lose a lot of value on that camera. I've taken way over 1 million images with my DSLR cameras, and my last 2 bodies, a 5D Mark III I sold with 488,000 shutter clicks, and my 5D Mark IV I sold with maybe 250,000 shutter clicks. So most of my images have been taken with DSLR cameras and they've done a fantastic job. But when the R5 came around the corner and I got my hands on one of the first bodies, I was just blown away by how well it was working. That brings me to jack of all trades, the R5, and my personal favorite camera at the moment. Having 45 megapixels, fantastic eye tracking, great in-body image stabilization, and super high frame rate is just something that I found very hard to pass up when it comes to my style of bird photography. The R5 allows me now in the field to focus more on the image taking and less on the shortcomings of the camera. With a camera like the 5D Mark IV, for instance, it was always a bit of a struggle to put the right autofocus field on the bird and then hopefully it would track it properly and you get a sharp image. With the R5, this is so much easier. You just press one button on the back of the camera, in my case, and the animal eye tracking will just track your subject all over your viewfinder, and you can actually do really nice composition in your camera already. So that has really helped me to take my creativity to the next level and also allowed me to take images, especially birds in flight and action shots that I wasn't able to previously take. Where the R5 really shines is as a hybrid camera because it offers me the ability to quickly switch between photo and video in the field. It not only takes great images but also fantastic video footage. And the best thing about it is that it has reliable eye tracking for birds in video mode. So I can actually rely on the camera to track the bird and keep the focus on it for me, and I just focus on composition. That means that I'm actually able to nicely do handheld video in the field, and combined with the great in-body image stabilization and the image stabilization in the RF lenses, the R5 gives me the ability to have fantastic handheld bird videos, and this is really something that has taken my video game to the next level. And of course, something like this YouTube video I'm also filming on the R5. Not all perfect about the R5. One annoying thing is that from time to time it overheats when you're shooting 4K high quality or 8K video. This has not really happened to me while I was living in Melbourne, but now in Queensland with much hotter weather, this happens from time to time. And last week when I was filming a YouTube video, it's actually shut down on me for the first time. It's important to note that it's only for video, but if you really want to film a video and your camera overheats and you can't film anymore, that's pretty frustrating. I'm lucky because I had 2 R5 bodies, so I could just swap to my other camera, but all in all, not really fun to deal with, and hopefully this will be something that we don't have to see in future cameras anymore. Another thing that's a bit annoying with the electronic shutter on the R5 is that you kind of get wonky images from time to time, especially at slower shutter speeds. If you just look at one image at a time, you don't really notice, but if you scroll through like a sequence of images, you will notice that some images are a bit stretched or a little bit compressed, and I assume that just the readout speed being a little bit too slow and the electronic shutter just creating a bit of a problem or creating a bit of a rolling shutter effect even in like normal images. So from time to time you have a series of images that is a little bit wonky. Not a deal breaker, but again, kind of annoying to deal with. Let's talk about the best overall stills camera that I've used, and that was the Sony A1. Just a fantastic all-around camera with stunning performance. 30 frames per second, no blackout, no rolling shutter, just amazing. What really impressed me about it is that once it acquires focus, it rarely lets go again. So I had scenes of birds flying against really busy backgrounds and would just perfectly track it against the sky, against a busy background, against a smoother background, no problems at all. So the tracking on that camera was really phenomenal. So I had a lot of fun with it in the field and took some fantastic images. And if I was shooting Sony, this camera would definitely be in my bag. I said best stills camera because the only downside I could really find with that camera is that I found it a little bit more difficult to switch quickly between photo and video, and the image stabilization in video mode wasn't as good compared to like an R5 and 100 to 500mm lens that's super stable. The Sony just seemed to jump around a little bit more. And the other downside was it doesn't have animal eye tracking in video mode, and that's something that I never really rely on. So not having that is a big downside, but overall for stills, hands down the best camera that I've used in the last year. All the things that I mentioned the R5 had that I didn't like, the A1 doesn't have. So it's essentially the perfect stills camera at the moment. That brings me to the best value for money mirrorless camera, and that has to be the R6. Has the same autofocus system as the R5, essentially the same abilities. It's just a different ergonomically designed body, having like a top dial instead of that electronic mode dial on the R5, and slightly different video features. For me personally, it's a little light on the megapixels with just 20 because it limits your ability in the field to crop, but I think most people would be very, very happy with that camera. And if you don't crop a lot, then 20 megapixels is still more than enough. One thing to keep in mind when you transition from like a 90D, for instance, or another APS-C crop camera to full-frame mirrorless camera, that you will lose a lot of reach. So if you're going from a 90D with 30 odd megapixels and 1.6 crop to a full-frame R6 with 20 megapixels, you will feel like your subjects are a lot further away from you and your ability to crop is also a bit more limited. So this is definitely something that you want to keep in mind, and hopefully Canon will address this gap in the market with a potential R7. Once I decided I only want to go mirrorless, I also had to make the decision which camera will be my second body. Will it gonna be an R6 or an R5? The R6 would have been the more sensible choice, but because I wanted to do a lot of video and also take a lot of photos with my second camera body, I decided against an R6 and went for a second R5. The main reason for that is that I could set up both of my R5s identically now, so whichever camera I grab, my fingers know exactly where to go. So I went with two R5s and I'm more than happy with my decision. Next we got the A9 II, another great camera that I got to use, but I just didn't get as warm with that camera and didn't enjoy it as much as the A1 in the field, for instance. The lack of eye tracking was something that I found a little bit difficult to deal with in the field, because once you're used to the eye tracking, you really don't want to miss it anymore. And another thing was, for instance, that all the preview embedded JPEGs were not full size. So if I want to use it with a program like Fast on Image Viewer, the files are just really small and I had to end up using a program like Bridge to go through the files. So this is something I wasn't really keen on, but all in all, still a fantastic camera that tracked the birds really well. But for my style of bird photography, I found the 24 megapixel to be borderline not enough, and missing the eye autofocus was something that I wasn't too happy about. So a great camera that still tracked the birds really well and had fantastic image quality, but overall I definitely preferred the A1 to the A9 II. The next piece of equipment I want to talk about is a lens, and definitely the best purchase I've made in the last year, if not ever. And I'm talking about the Canon 100 to 500 RF lens. I know it's a little bit expensive and f7.1 sounds not very fun to use in the field. I thought exactly the same when I heard about this lens first, and I wasn't very interested in it at all. But then in March 2021 I had the chance to take the 100 to 500 into the field, and after just a few hours I knew I had to have one. It has amazing image quality that's similar to a good prime lens. It has lightning fast autofocus, fantastic image stabilization in a body that's slightly lighter than the 100-400 version 2, for instance. Most of my favorite images from 2021 were actually taken with that lens and often on the shorter end. So having this ability to have this little lens with me, handhold it in the field, and also having the ability to really easily handhold video has been a tremendous impact for me, and I'm really happy that I have that lens, because oftentimes now I just grab this lens, the 2 extenders, one R5, put it in a little backpack and go for a walk, and I can get fantastic images because this lens doesn't only work without the extenders, but it still delivers good image quality even with the extenders. So I have a really nice and lightweight combo. When it comes to the f7.1 wide open, it's not ideal, but it's also not a deal breaker, especially with the new cameras that can handle much higher ISOs. You will need to use them, but then the lens actually works quite well. I've recently used it a lot in dark rainforests as well, and while I pretty much had ISO 12,800 as my base ISO, I was still able to get some fantastic images, and with my workflow and Dix or Puro, they cleaned up really nicely and I got some fantastic images handheld in the dark rainforest and also some beautiful video. If you want to learn about image editing and how to make your images look absolutely amazing, just like these examples, make sure to check out my masterclass down there in the description. The only thing I don't like about the 100-500 is that when you put on an extender, you can't zoom in fully anymore. So you're basically not having with the 1.4 extender 140 to 700 millimeter lens, you have a 420 to 700 millimeter lens because you cannot zoom any further back than 300 millimeters. And even to put the extender on, you have to zoom all the way out to 300 millimeters. So this is definitely kind of an annoying downside about this lens, but all in all, the positives definitely outweigh the negatives for me. That brings me to the 100-400 version 2 lens. I also had a lot of fun with that lens in the field, and it does everything as good as the 100-500 pretty much, except that it's lacking the 500 millimeters on the long end. So for many people this would be the better choice, because ultimately the 100-500 is pretty hefty with the price tag. So having a 100-400, maybe even a used one, could be a sensible choice, getting a great lens with great sharpness and great image quality and good image stabilization. The only difference is on the mirrorless cameras you have to use this adapter, but that's not a problem at all. So that's why I call it the sensible choice, because I think if you already own a 100-400, you might feel like upgrading to the 100-500 is not worth it. Although for me personally, I definitely prefer the 100-500 for that extra 100 millimeters, and that especially shows with birds in flight, for instance, because there I can have an extra 100 millimeters natively without having to use an extender or anything else, and the autofocus is just so super fast on that 100-500 millimeter lens. So there I feel like there's a distinct advantage in the field, but overall both of these lenses are fantastic, and definitely when it comes to the price, the 100-400 version 2 is a lot more attractive in most countries. Let's talk about the best ever value for money telephoto wildlife lens made, the Sony 200-600 millimeter lens. I was really looking forward to trying it out in the field, and that lens absolutely did not disappoint. If anything, I had high expectation and it completely surpassed them. It's a great small package. The throw of the zoom is so short that you can easily zoom from 200 to 600 millimeters with just one finger. It has great sharpness, fast autofocus, and it's a fantastic all-around lens. I enjoyed it very much in the field, and I wish Canon had that lens because I would instantly buy it. It also worked really well with the extender, so just a fantastic walk-around combo that could almost rival a big 600 millimeter prime lens. Maybe not as much when it comes to the sharpness, the prime lens will still win out there, but when it comes to flexibility and usability, that lens on the A1 was amazing. And for a short moment I was thinking, should I buy an A1 and a 200-600 just to be able to use that lens, because I had so much fun in the field with it. And For any Sony shooter, this lens is really a no-brainer, especially at that price point. The main downside with that lens was that it was much harder to get smooth video footage because the image stabilization, even in combination with the A1, wasn't as smooth as an R5 with 100 to 500, for instance. Let's talk about a pair of Gimmick lenses that surprised me a lot because they actually work. When I first heard about the 800 and 600 f11, I thought these lenses just had to be trash. But when I actually picked it up for the first time in the store, I thought they're pretty light and this could actually be a fun lens for a lot of people that might not care about the ultimate image quality, but rather want to have a good time walking around, bird watching, taking pictures of birds or other distant subjects. So I thought there might be a real market for these lenses if they can at least deliver decent image quality. So I took them out in the field and was pleasantly surprised. With nice light, you could get pretty good images. So all in all, a very interesting lens, especially when you consider the price point of under $1,000 for an 800mm lens that you can easily walk around with. It's basically unheard of. Obviously, not everything is great with these lenses. For instance, birds in flight, I felt like they were quite iffy and would jump on and off from your subject, and the tracking wasn't all that great. And also when you're using these lenses, your autofocus area is limited to a smaller square in the middle of the frame. So there are a few limitations with these lenses, but all in all, in good light, they performed really well. Would I want to use them in a dark rainforest? No. But if you love shorebirds or you're living in Florida, for instance, you have nice light, you can use high shutter speeds, these lenses can actually be quite fun to use and a great addition to many people's camera bags because they're just so light and cheap. Let's talk about the big guns and my other favorite lens, my 600mm version 2 f4 lens that is pretty much my other go-to lens other than the 100 to 500mm lens, and is really important when it comes to creating my unique style of bird images, because with this lens you have those smooth out of focus backgrounds basically built in. Whenever you focus on something, it's almost by default that you get a nice soft out of focus background, and that is a big part of my bird photography. Besides those great looking backgrounds, this lens also delivers amazing sharpness even wide open, and it also works extremely well with the 1.4 and the 2x extenders, so you can get that extra reach up to 1200mm if the bird's a bit further away from you, or if you want to take a nice headshot, for instance. So all in all, the perfect bird photography lens for me. The biggest downside with this lens is pretty much just the size and the weight. For me personally, going forward, the perfect combo for bird photography will be 100 to 500 RF plus a 600mm prime lens that covers me basically for everything. Another lens that I got to use was my mate Dwade's 500mm version 2 lens. Another fantastic lens. Basically everything I said about the 600mm lens is also true about the 500mm version 2 prime lens. Great sharpness, works great with extenders, has nice smooth out of focus backgrounds, and all around great lens. The only thing I think with a 500mm lens now, the main reason to own one, at least for me in the past, was that it's lighter than a 600mm lens. But now if you compare it to the RF version 600mm versus EF version 500mm version 2, it's almost the same weight. The 600 is a bit bigger, but when it comes to the weight, there's not as much of a difference anymore. So personally, I would always gravitate towards a 600mm lens, but 500mm version 2, fantastic lens, and I really enjoyed using it in the field as well. That brings me to the 800mm f5.6 lens. It kind of felt like a little bit heavy, a little bit slow. It seemed to just work better on DSLR cameras than it does on the mirrorless cameras. So out of the big guns, the 5.6 800 was my least favorite. It still works well, you get great image quality. The other thing with the 800 was also the large minimum focusing distance, I think of 6 meters, which sometimes makes it hard because you just can't be close enough to your subject, or you have a subject that's coming closer and closer and closer and you can't focus half the time. So it's not a bad lens at all, but I just think there are better choices out there now. So I wouldn't buy one new now, but if you can pick up like a used one for a great price, it's definitely still a good lens. Another lens that I briefly used was the 500 and 600 version 1. The first thing you have to keep in mind is that they're extremely heavy, have much slower autofocus, and not as good image stabilization. There are no spare parts available anymore, so if anything breaks in these lenses, you basically have to throw the lens away. These lenses are not bad, but I think there's just better options out there. For instance, I would personally prefer an RF 100-500 over a 500mm prime lens version 1 because it's so much lighter and more fun to use in the field. I also got to try a few third-party lenses, in particular the Tamron 150-500 for Sony and the Tamron 150-600 for Canon. The Tamron 150-500 for Sony actually quite surprised me. It was kind of on the heavy side, but it was a nicely built lens, nice and fast autofocus, good tracking. The only thing was, especially in video mode, the image stabilization in the lens was really jerky and jumpy, so it's actually quite difficult to deal with that. So a good lens with a few flaws, but as I said before, for Sony, if you're looking for a wildlife lens, I feel like the 200-600 is probably your ultimate choice unless you really need that shorter 150 or 100mm on that shorter side. When I was using the 150-600 on the Canon, I noticed a similar thing. The image stabilization was just a little bit jumpy and jerky, and also the autofocus was kind of pulsing a little bit, like it felt like it grabbed the subject and it let it go, it grabbed it. So I had a lot of images that were not tack sharp. As a beginner lens, for instance, I think it's a fantastic entry because it's so nice to go all the way to that 600mm range, but the lens definitely has a few shortcomings that you need to be aware of. That brings me to the last of the longer lenses that I've used last year for wildlife, and that's a 5.6 400mm Canon lens. It's a fantastic little lens that has really nice image quality and good autofocus. The only real and problematic downside with this lens is that it doesn't have any image stabilization, so you need much higher shutter speed than comparable other lenses. You can definitely pick this lens up quite cheap and it can be a nice viable option then, but personally I'd probably prefer 100-400 version 2 or 100-500mm lens simply because they have faster autofocus, probably better image quality, and that image stabilization that makes a huge difference. At the beginning I said that I started the year with 7 EF lenses and now only have 2 left, which is not entirely true because I still have 2 others, but these are actually just being sold. So I have a 16-35 that I'm selling and a 24-70 that I'm also selling because I just grew tired of using the adapter with these shorter lenses, because if I use this adapter with a shorter lens like the 16-35, it actually becomes quite a long lens. If I want to do a vlog, for instance, I'm holding this, it was kind of annoying. So I'm upgrading to the 14-35 Canon lens. I already bought it. It's a really cool lens. I'm really looking forward to be using that more. And I'm currently filming on the 24-105mm lens RF that is fantastic, great image quality, really nice and quiet autofocus. So I'm really happy with that lens as well. And that will replace this 24-70mm lens that I used in the past. So the only lens I will be left with that's EF is my 600mm prime lens and this 70-200mm lens. I would love to replace this with an RF version, but the RF versions are just so expensive that I rather, at least for now, stick with the EF version because I don't use it as much. And this adapter works well, even though, especially on this already long lens, it makes this lens really long and stick out, which I'm not a big fan of, but at this current stage at least, I don't really want to spend $4,000 on getting a 70-200mm lens that I don't use much. So everything else will be RF lenses because they are just nicer lenses, better autofocus, better image stabilization, great image quality, and I don't have to use the adapter anymore, which is not a problem. It works really well, but at times it can be annoying, especially if you forget it at home and you're trying to get your lens on and you can't get it on. I might also replace my 600 EF with a 600 RF down the road in 2022, but I want to first of all try the RF version in the field and then see how I feel about it, because it just doesn't seem as much of an upgrade as I had hoped for. With all this gear talk, it's important to remember that it's the most important thing that you're actually having fun with the gear that you currently own and that you take it and get out there. Because the best camera is the one in your hand, no matter what brand or camera model that may be. And don't get discouraged. You don't have to afford the most expensive newest gear. It's fun to use, but you definitely don't need it to take fantastic images. You can take a cheaper DSLR camera with a cheaper lens and you can take amazing images. So most importantly, make sure that you're out there having fun. I hope you guys had fun watching this video and that I could give you some insights into the gear I've used and hopefully helped you to make up your own mind of what gear you might want to purchase in the future. So leave me a comment with what gear you might be looking to purchase in 2022 and the best gear that you have used over the last 2 years. Give me a thumbs up for this video, make sure to subscribe to my channel, check out my masterclass down there in the description, and I will see you guys in the next video very soon. Bye!